October 19th, 2001.
Over 100 U.S. Army Rangers attack a Taliban target in southern Afghanistan. Tonight, we'll look at the land where they were sent. The fighters they've been assigned to help. The people they're hoping to bring down.
You
will lose your sons and loved ones and money in this new losing war.
And the next generation being taught to hate.
Yes, I hate America because they do cruel things against the Taliban.
Tonight, on the ground against the Taliban, as America fights back.
From ABC News, this is Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
There is every reason in the world to keep the location and timing of U.S. military operations secret before they get underway. Once a ground operation against enemy forces has begun, however, it's a fair assumption that word is going to leak out, and it did. In the Pakistani capital of Islamabad today, a local military official told reporters that his government had received word from U.S. officials. U.S. Special Forces, he said, would be conducting hit-and-run operations in Taliban-controlled areas of Afghanistan. The goal? To flush out Osama bin Laden, leaders of his network, and the Taliban. Since everyone from President Bush on down has declared that as U.S. policy for weeks, it was a relatively safe description of the mission. Variations of that story were percolating here in Washington yesterday. As we told you last night, this morning's Washington Post carried the banner headline, Special Forces Open Ground Campaign. You may recall there were similar stories in the media some weeks ago, but that may have been a deliberate case of disinformation by the Pentagon. Tonight, though, it was the real thing. And while no one at the Pentagon went on record until just about an hour or so ago, they are talking to reporters on background now. ABC's Martha Raddatz is covering the story for us. And Martha, what can you tell us?
Ted, a U.S. official confirms that there was a Special Forces operation today in southern Afghanistan involving over 100 Special Forces. They will say very little about it. They're now cleared of Afghan airspace and presumably safe. But 2 U.S. service members were killed in Pakistan in a helicopter crash. They have not been identified yet, and 3 or 4 others were injured in that crash. That helicopter was standing by in case rescue assistance was needed inside Afghanistan. Their assistance wasn't needed. The Black Hawk helicopter went back to Pakistan and landed, and that's when it crashed on landing. It was not hostile action.
As to the operation that took place inside Afghanistan, do we know where it was? Do we know how many operations there were? Because the big one, I gather, was in Kandahar. Is that right?
It's believed to be in Kandahar. They are not talking about the target, only to say it was a Taliban target. They will go no further than that on what was targeted. The Pentagon is going to give a complete briefing tomorrow and give more details about that.
All right, Martha, if you'd be good enough to stand by and please jump in whenever you feel the need. We're joined now by General Terry Scott. From 1993 to 1996, General Scott led the U.S. Army Special Operations Command. He joins us from Coleman, Texas. John Hillen is a retired Army captain and Special Operations officer. During Operation Desert Storm, he led a unit into Iraq one day before the Allied ground war began. And he joins us from our New York studios. General Scott, let me leave it wide open to you. From what you have just heard, what do you make of it? What kind of operation do you think it was?
Well, Ted, as you said, there have been rumors and information for about 36 hours that there were going to be ground operations. I would suggest that this was probably a well-planned operation based on some hard intelligence, because it was very important, I think, for the initial raid into Afghanistan to be successful. Therefore, I expect the target was picked that had been carefully looked at and was struck. Again, most special operations are successful if they require 30 minutes plus or minus on the ground, and I expect this was very short duration, and the troops were extracted right away. It was probably based on intelligence either developed by the Special Operations Forces through a prior reconnaissance or through some other means.
When General Scott speaks of an operation that lasts 30 minutes or less, John Hill, and what happens to the helicopters that brought them in during that time? Do they stand off a few miles away or hover around the area providing cover? What usually goes on?
Ted, can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah, please do.
Let me just tell you that I know the operation lasted a couple of hours, if that changes anyone's answers.
Okay, very good. John?
Yeah, well, General Scott's very much right about the time on the ground. The time on the ground needs to be a very short duration and is usually of a small scale. But the operation supporting a special operation strike may be much larger. Support aircraft, support helicopters in addition to the assault helicopters, and a whole assembly working behind the scenes to support the raid. So you could have a raid that could be composed of quite a large group, but the actual time on the ground and the actual number of forces taking part in the strike could be quite small.
So when, General Scott, we talk about an operation, as I think Martha said, of something in excess of 100 men, that would not necessarily be 100 men on the ground.
Well, it's hard to say. I would think that a 100-man raid is about a Ranger company, and it could be that they put that many on the ground. It could also have been much smaller, and a significant number of those people could have been supporting in some other roles, such as search and rescue, standby to help extract if there were problems and all that. I think we'll just have to wait till tomorrow to find out exactly how many people that were inserted on the ground if they tell us.
Something else, Ted, I can tell you as well is that I was told earlier today when this started leaking out somewhat is that they were not going after individuals. They were not going after Osama bin Laden or any of his lieutenants at this point. This was not any sort of snatch operation, is what I was told earlier today. They were either targeting a building or barracks or an airfield or something like that.
Well, when you talk about targeting, and I want to be sure, Martha, I understand you. When you talk about targeting a building, why would you send a special operations team in to target a building when presumably a building could be taken out from the air?
Well, certainly there might be forces in the area, but it was not any particular person. There might be forces in that building that they wanted to go after. They might have surprised some people who were in aircraft around the area. There was some element of surprise. Obviously, they needed to do that instead of from the air, and they could also offer targeting help as well.
John Hill, and when General Scott talks about this looking as though it was a carefully planned and prepared operation, you like to think that all operations are carefully planned and prepared, but I think what he's saying is there are times when you can react to a target of opportunity very quickly or relatively quickly, and times when an operation is planned over a period of days and maybe weeks. Is that what you understand?
That's right. And in this kind of campaign, I think as we move through the various phases of these operations, I think our special operations forces are going to have to become more and more opportunistic. Intelligence will be fleeting, it will be perishable, and ultimately they'll need to strike while the iron's hot. This type of operation, being the first operation, was probably one that was planned out well in advance and gone in with the intent to either gather some very special intelligence or destroy some special resources perhaps that aided the al-Qaeda network and the Taliban. But in the future, I think you'll see more opportunistic strikes that'll operate on very short notice.
General Scott, John Hillen, let me ask you to stand by. We'll be back with General Scott and Captain John Hillen a little later in the broadcast. But when we return, a glimpse into the theater of war inside Afghanistan.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Mitsubishi Motors.
Sunday, the military's new top officer in his first interview since taking command, plus Senate leaders Daschle and Lott on the anthrax threat. 3 exclusives you can't miss on This Week.
One of the goals of U.S. Special Forces on the ground in Afghanistan is support of the Taliban opposition army, known as the Northern Alliance. ABC News correspondent Don Daler has spent some time with those rebels.
Morning reveille in the northern Afghanistan mountains. Another mortar round sent on its way to the Taliban positions on the other ridges. Never a barrage, never an orchestrated onslaught of tank fire and artillery. Just the occasional, random, but nonetheless deadly projectile that only sometimes finds a human at the receiving end. Like these. Meet the Taliban, soldiers and figures in black, who 1 year ago pushed the Northern Alliance into these stunningly beautiful mountains, while taking from them one of an endless number of cities. The Taliban forces now control 90% of the country. But the Northern Alliance drew the line here on these barren ridges and said no further. A line in the sand formed by trenches that crawl over hillsides like surgical scars. A line from which, reportedly just weeks ago, these few dozen alliance fighters repulsed an advance by 500 Taliban. Here, and no further.
In a peaceful world, the city of Taloqan at the end of the valley behind me here would be inconsequential to anybody who didn't live there. But after half a decade of losing acre after acre and town after town, the Northern Alliance is finally poised to leave its mountain emplacements here and retake the city. And the implications of that are huge.
Because even though any victory is a reversal of fortune, this one would be an answer to their prayers. 18-year-old Ahmad Ullah escaped Taloqan when the tanks rolled in. It's a big city, he says. It has parks and schools. When the Taliban captured Taloqan, they destroyed everything. Before it was captured, Taloqan was good. The nearby village of Khalifgan is swollen with those who, like Ahmad, made it out of Taloqan in time. Many of them are still armed and eager to return home. Khalifgan has the feel of a frontier town, a little edgy, a little dangerous, maybe because of what many of the people here witnessed and suffered. When the Taliban came, he says, if people weren't in their houses, they burned them down. Anyone they saw, they arrested and sent to prison. When the Taliban started shelling the city, it was Northern Alliance General Ayub who oversaw the retreat, and it is he who will oversee the attack. We had to leave Taloqan, he says, so that the citizens would not all die. This career soldier, who once fought the Soviets, makes no distinction between those invaders and the Taliban. Neither, he says, belongs here. The enemy is the enemy. Whoever invades our country, the Russians or the Taliban, they are the enemy. I've been given the job of perfecting our soldiers, he says. Now our soldiers are ready to recapture the area that we lost. Back on the mountains, night is falling. Since knocking out the Taliban's big gun with a tank shot 2 months ago, the men up here have little to fear in way of return fire. Their tanks can reach the Taliban, but the Taliban can't reach them. Still, after dark, the soldiers retreat to their cave-like bunkers. At this altitude, the minute the sun disappears, the air turns frigid. It's a difficult life, to say the least. Like soldiers everywhere and in every era, a bonding takes place. What they've seen and done is something no one else can understand. Pleasures are few, but with a little ingenuity and a bootleg generator, the nights don't have to be completely boring. Unless you've drawn sentry duty, like Muhammad Ayoun, who got to know the Taliban firsthand as a prisoner of war. He showed us the Red Cross card given during a prisoner exchange. When the Taliban first took us prisoner, he says, there were 60 of us. They killed 6. Everyone up here has his own personal reasons for enduring all this. For Ayoun, it's the bullet hole in his belly from a Taliban machine gun, and something more. I have no other choice, he says. I must defend our country. If I will be captured 10 times, if I will be killed 10 times, it is the same for me. If the enemy comes to our country and interferes in our lives, we must fight. And a few hours later, when the Taliban anti-aircraft reaches out for the American planes it cannot find, the alliance fighters settled in for a quiet night and smile and wait. I'm Don Daler for Nightline in northern Afghanistan.
How might U.S. Special Forces be working with those Northern Alliance soldiers, and are their goals really one and the same? Those and other questions when we come back.